What if the most expensive part of visiting New York is not the hotel, the flight, or the attractions, but the moment you realize the city was never designed for you to enjoy it in the first place? New York still sells itself as the ultimate destination, a place where dreams are made, where energy replaces sleep, and where every street promises opportunity. Movies, social media, travel ads, and decades of cultural mythology have built a powerful image of a city that rewards anyone who dares to step into it. But the first hours inside New York already begin to fracture that illusion. The shock does not come all at once. It arrives quietly, disguised as normality. The airport feels tense and hostile, not welcoming. The first taxi ride feels oddly expensive for such a short distance. The hotel lobby looks impressive, but something feels off when paperwork starts piling up. At this stage, most visitors still believe the problem is personal. Maybe they chose the wrong season. Maybe New York is just intense. That belief is exactly what keeps the system invisible. New York is no longer a city that hosts visitors. It is a machine optimized to extract value from anyone who enters it, and it does so without calling it what it is. There are no warning signs, no official announcements, no dramatic breakdowns. Instead, there is a slow, constant financial erosion that begins the moment you land. Every interaction carries friction. Every basic need comes with a surcharge. Every decision feels slightly punishing, even when you are doing nothing extravagant. This is where the concept of hidden tariffs begins to matter. Not tariffs announced by governments, but urban tariffs embedded into daily life, fees that feel small in isolation, but devastating in accumulation. Costs attached to convenience, to safety, to speed, to simply existing inside the city. The genius of the system is that it never frames these as exploitation. It frames them as the price of access, the cost of ambition, the privilege of being there. Visitors often notice the exhaustion before they notice the money disappearing, the constant need to calculate, to compare, to justify spending. The subtle anxiety that follows you from morning to night. You are not relaxing. You are managing risk. You are negotiating every meal, every ride, every step. This is not accidental, it is structural. New York has quietly transformed from a destination into a financial obstacle course. What makes this transformation so powerful is denial. Locals normalize it. Institutions ignore it. Tourism marketing refuses to acknowledge it, and visitors blame themselves. The city no longer needs to convince people it is expensive. It convinces them that suffering financially is part of the authentic experience, that if you are uncomfortable, stressed, or bleeding money, you are doing New York correctly. But this video is not about exaggeration or shock value. It is about understanding a system that hides in plain sight. Because once you see how these hidden tariffs work, you start to understand why fewer people want to visit, why trips feel shorter, heavier, and strangely disappointing. And more importantly, why New York may be showing the future of urban tourism everywhere else. Before we go any further, this is the moment where understanding really matters. What you are hearing is not a rant, not a complaint, and not an isolated travel story. It is a pattern. And patterns only become visible when people stop scrolling past them and start engaging with what they recognize. If any part of this feels familiar, if you have visited New York or planned to and sensed something was off, leave a comment right now. Even a single word like noticed or felt it helps surface how widespread this experience truly is. Liking this video is not about boosting numbers. It is about signaling that this conversation matters, that the glossy version of urban life deserves to be questioned. Subscribing means you are choosing to see what usually stays hidden behind marketing slogans and postcard imagery. This channel exists to connect the dots most people never slow down enough to see. Because what we just uncovered is only the surface. The real financial damage does not come from one big expense. It comes from layers, small charges, silent fees, everyday decisions that slowly turn a trip into a financial hole without ever announcing themselves. And once you understand how the first layer works, the rest becomes impossible to ignore. What makes New York especially dangerous for visitors is not that it is expensive in an obvious way, but that the city has mastered the art of charging without announcing the charge. There is no single moment where your budget collapses. Instead, there is a slow leak. Money leaves your hands in ways that feel too small to question, too normal to resist, and too frequent to track. By the time you realize something is wrong, the damage is already done. It starts with friction. Nothing in New York is smooth. Every basic action carries a cost attached to convenience, speed, or avoidance of discomfort. Want to save time instead of figuring out the subway? That convenience has a price. Want to avoid standing in line, walking long distances, or dealing with uncertainty? There is always a paid shortcut. These are not luxuries. They are framed as necessities in a city that deliberately makes the free option exhausting. What is crucial to understand is that these costs are not random. They are embedded into the urban design. Prices fluctuate constantly, creating decision fatigue. You are forced to make dozens of small financial choices every day, each one draining a little more mental energy. Over time, most visitors stop calculating. They surrender. That surrender is where the real extraction begins. This is why New York feels financially heavy, even when you are not doing anything special. A simple coffee becomes a calculation. A short ride becomes a negotiation. A quick meal becomes an unexpectedly expensive commitment. None of these moments feel dramatic enough to trigger alarm, but together they create a constant background anxiety. You are always slightly behind, slightly overspending, slightly compensating. Every city has prices. New York has penalties. Penalties for not knowing the system, penalties for hesitation, penalties for being unfamiliar. Visitors pay more because they lack local knowledge, but the city ensures that learning the rules takes time and money. This creates a loop where inexperience is punished repeatedly, not once. At some point, the trip shifts psychologically. You are no longer exploring. You are minimizing losses. You start choosing based on fear of overpaying, rather than curiosity or enjoyment. This is one of the most overlooked hidden tariffs of all. The cost of mental exhaustion, the loss of spontaneity, the feeling that every wrong choice will be expensive. And this is where New York's reputation becomes its greatest shield. People expect the city to be costly, so they accept the drain without questioning the structure behind it. They assume the problem is their planning, not the system itself. But what if the city is not just expensive, but intentionally designed to extract maximum value from every moment you are inside it? Because once you see that the city charges before you even realize you are paying, it becomes impossible to ignore what happens next, especially when it comes to the place where most visitors lose the largest amount of money while believing they made a reasonable choice. Accommodation in New York is where the illusion of control finally collapses. This is the point where most visitors believe they made a smart decision. They compared options, read reviews, chose a location that seemed reasonable, maybe even felt relieved after clicking Book Now. But what they booked was not a room. It was an entry point into one of the most sophisticated financial traps in modern urban tourism. The advertised price is never the real price. It is an invitation. Once you arrive, the real transaction begins. Mandatory fees appear with official names that sound harmless, almost justified. Facility fees, destination fees, urban fees, charges that are presented as standard, non-negotiable, and conveniently separated from the original booking. By the time you see them, you are already standing at the front desk, tired, disoriented, and locked in. What makes this system effective is timing. These fees are revealed when resistance is lowest. After a long flight, after navigating a hostile arrival, after you have mentally committed to staying. Walking away feels impossible, so payment becomes automatic. The city does not need to force you. It simply waits until you are too invested to say no. Even budget accommodation is no refuge. Smaller rooms, shared spaces, minimal services, yet prices that rival full apartments in other, cities. Space itself has become a luxury commodity. Silence costs extra. Privacy costs extra. Basic comfort costs extra. And if something goes wrong, the burden quietly shifts back to you. Refund policies are rigid. Flexibility is rare. The risk is always externalized to the visitor. Then there are deposits, holds, temporary charges that freeze large amounts of money without warning. Funds disappear from your account not as spending, but as immobilized capital. This creates a subtle pressure. You feel poorer without technically having spent more. It alters your behavior. You eat less. You walk more. You avoid experiences. The accommodation itself begins shaping the rest of your trip financially. What is rarely discussed is how this impacts the psychology of the stay. Your room stops feeling like a place of rest. It becomes a reminder of loss. Every night you return, you subconsciously calculate what that space is costing you per hour. Relaxation becomes difficult. Sleep feels transactional. You are paying too much to waste time, yet too exhausted to enjoy it fully. This is not accidental. New York's housing crisis did not stop at residents. It spilled into tourism. The same scarcity logic applies. Extract maximum value from minimal space. Normalize it. Label it as the New York experience. Visitors internalize the idea that discomfort is part of authenticity, when in reality, it is part of monetization. And once accommodation has drained more than expected, everything else becomes fragile. Your budget is already compromised before the day even starts. This is where the trip shifts again. Because when sleep itself becomes expensive, even something as basic as eating turns into another financial battlefield. Food in New York is marketed as culture, identity, and experience, but for visitors it quickly turns into a relentless financial drain that never gives you a moment to recover. Eating is not an event here. It is a recurring charge. And because it happens multiple times a day, it becomes one of the most effective hidden tariffs of the entire trip. The first shock is how difficult it is to eat normally, not luxuriously, not extravagantly, just normally. A simple breakfast that would feel routine elsewhere becomes a calculated expense. Coffee prices climb past comfort, portions shrink, and taxes quietly stack on top of already inflated menus. By the time you sit down, you are already paying more than you expected, even if you chose the most modest option available. Then comes the tipping structure. What was once a voluntary gesture has become an unspoken obligation, socially enforced and emotionally charged. Visitors are expected to tip at levels that significantly raise the final cost of every meal, regardless of service quality. Refusing feels uncomfortable. Reducing feels judged. The system shifts responsibility onto you, turning every transaction into a moral dilemma layered on top of a financial one. This pressure compounds quickly. You eat 3 times a day, sometimes more. Each meal feels slightly overpriced, slightly disappointing, and slightly stressful. Over time, those small differences accumulate into a major budget leak. But because no single meal feels outrageous enough to trigger alarm, the drain continues unchecked. At some point, visitors begin altering behavior. They skip meals, they settle for convenience food, they eat standing up or on the move, not because they want to, but because sitting down feels expensive. The city subtly pushes you away from pleasure and toward efficiency. Food stops being nourishment or enjoyment and becomes fuel consumed under pressure. What makes this worse is unpredictability. Prices fluctuate wildly based on location, timing, and demand. 2 similar meals can cost radically different amounts just a few blocks apart. This creates constant uncertainty. You are always guessing, always second-guessing, always wondering if you just overpaid again. This unpredictability feeds mental fatigue. You stop exploring, you stop experimenting. You stick to what feels safest, not what looks interesting. The city becomes smaller, not because there is less to see, but because the financial risk of curiosity feels too high. And this is where New York's food culture reveals its darker side. The city celebrates abundance but monetizes scarcity. It offers endless options, but punishes hesitation. It turns something as basic as eating into a daily reminder that you are being charged for existing within its borders. Transportation in New York is often presented as efficient, iconic, and accessible. But for visitors, it quickly reveals itself as another hidden tariff layered into daily movement. Getting from one place to another is never just movement. It is a sequence of decisions, mistakes, corrections, and penalties that quietly turn mobility into a recurring expense. The subway looks simple on a map. But in reality, it demands familiarity, timing, and emotional resilience. Miss one train and you lose time. Enter the wrong platform and you lose money. Buy the wrong ticket option and you overpay without realizing it. For locals, this knowledge is accumulated over years. For visitors, every mistake is monetized immediately. What makes this system especially punishing is stress. Stations are crowded, noisy, and visually overwhelming. Signs compete for attention. Trains arrive inconsistently. Under pressure, people default to faster solutions. Ride-sharing apps feel safer, clearer, more controlled. And that is exactly where the cost accelerates. Short distances become surprisingly expensive rides. Surge pricing appears without warning. Traffic transforms minutes into hours. What seemed like a reasonable alternative becomes a financial concession. Visitors tell themselves it is temporary, that they will balance it later, but later never comes. The city's pace keeps forcing the same decision again and again. Walking is often suggested as a solution, but even that carries a price. Distance in New York is deceptive. What looks close on a map becomes exhausting in practice. Long walks drain energy, limit plans, and increase reliance on convenience spending later in the day. Fatigue becomes another indirect cost, pushing people back toward paid transport even when they intended to avoid it. There is also the penalty of unfamiliarity. Choosing the wrong route, exiting at the wrong stop, or misjudging time costs more than money. It creates anxiety. You start padding schedules, leaving early, overcompensating with paid options just to avoid uncertainty. The city charges you not only for movement, but for peace of mind. Over time, transportation shapes the entire trip. Neighborhoods feel farther apart. Exploration shrinks. You cluster activities to reduce movement, not because it is enjoyable, but because movement feels expensive. The city becomes fragmented, experienced in disconnected pockets rather than as a whole. What is rarely acknowledged is how deliberate this feels. A city where time is scarce and confusion is constant naturally pushes people toward paid shortcuts. Transportation becomes less about access and more about extraction. Every wrong turn, every hesitation, every moment of doubt feeds the same system. By the time visitors recognize how much they have spent just trying to move around, the pattern is already familiar. New York does not punish extravagance. It punishes inexperience. And that punishment does not stop at transit. It follows you even into the most basic moments of the day, where you least expect another charge to appear. At a certain point in New York, visitors begin to realize that even standing still costs money. This is where the city's hidden tariffs become almost surreal. You are no longer paying for services, transport, or accommodation. You are paying for permission. Permission to rest, to wait, to use space, to meet basic human needs without friction. Public space in New York is no longer truly public. Places where people would normally pause, sit, or recover are either monetized, restricted, or intentionally uncomfortable. Benches are scarce. Seating is conditional. Staying too long in one place draws attention. The city subtly communicates that lingering is not welcome unless you are paying for it. Bathrooms are one of the clearest examples. Finding a free, accessible restroom becomes a challenge. That forces spending. Coffee shops, stores, fast food chains all quietly enforce purchase requirements. A basic bodily need is transformed into a transaction. Visitors comply without thinking because resistance feels embarrassing, awkward, or disruptive. Another small charge disappears from the budget, unnoticed but cumulative. Then there are attractions that feel unavoidable. Museums with suggested donations that feel mandatory. Viewing platforms with prices that rival short flights. Experiences marketed as once in a lifetime that quietly rely on fear of missing out. The city leverages reputation to justify constant upselling. Saying no feels like wasting the trip. Saying yes feels financially reckless. Most people choose yes. Even free activities come with hidden costs. Waiting in line burns time and energy, pushing visitors toward paid alternatives nearby. Parks are surrounded by overpriced food and drinks. Public events trigger crowding that makes movement harder and spending more likely. The city ensures that even moments labeled as free are embedded inside spending ecosystems. What makes this especially draining is frequency. These charges are not dramatic. They are repetitive. A few dollars here, a few more there, over and over, all day long. The mind stops registering them as expenses and starts accepting them as background noise. This is how extraction becomes invisible. Psychologically, something shifts. Visitors stop feeling like guests and start feeling like obstacles. Every action seems to require justification through payment. You are not welcomed. You are tolerated as long as you contribute financially. The city no longer feels curious or open. It feels transactional. This constant monetization changes behavior. People rush. They avoid pauses. They cut conversations short. They move on before enjoying the moment because staying feels costly. The city becomes a series of checkpoints instead of experiences. The rhythm accelerates, not because it is exciting, but because slowing down feels expensive. By the time visitors notice how often they are paying simply to exist, frustration replaces wonder. New York stops feeling alive and starts feeling aggressive. And this aggressiveness is not random. It is the result of a city that has learned how to monetize every square meter of attention and presence. But this pressure does not only affect individuals, it reshapes the entire tourism model. Because when a city turns every step into a charge, it begins attracting a very different kind of visitor and pushing everyone else away. At this stage, it becomes clear that tourism in New York is no longer about hospitality or discovery. It is about extraction. The city has quietly shifted from welcoming visitors to processing them. Tourists are not guests. They are temporary revenue streams moving through a carefully designed funnel of spending opportunities, each one optimized to capture as much value as possible before they leave. The experience is intentionally fragmented. Instead of a coherent journey, visitors encounter a series of isolated transactions. Buy a ticket here, pay extra there, upgrade now, skip the line, reserve access. Everything is modular, disconnected, and monetized individually. This fragmentation prevents visitors from ever seeing the full cost at once. You never feel robbed in a single moment. You feel drained over time. What replaces hospitality is efficiency. Staff are not hostile, but they are not warm either. Interactions feel rushed, procedural, transactional. The goal is not to make you feel welcome. The goal is to keep the flow moving. Lingering slows the system. Questions slow the system. Doubt slows the system. So the city discourages all three. Tourist areas are especially engineered for this. Prices are higher, quality is lower, and volume is relentless. Experiences are standardized to reduce friction and increase turnover. Authenticity becomes a performance, repeated endlessly for new arrivals. Visitors sense this instinctively. Something feels hollow, something feels staged, but they struggle to articulate why. This is where disappointment quietly replaces excitement. Not because the city lacks landmarks or history, but because the experience feels extractive rather than enriching. You are consuming New York, but New York is consuming you faster. The imbalance becomes emotionally noticeable. People take photos but feel disconnected. They move through crowds but feel alone. What makes this model so effective is that it hides behind reputation. New York's global status protects it from scrutiny. Visitors assume discomfort is part of the legend. That exhaustion is proof they are doing it right. That financial strain is the price of authenticity. The city never has to defend itself. The myth does the work. Over time, this changes who comes and who stays away. Visitors become shorter term, less curious, more transactional themselves. They arrive with defensive spending strategies, rigid itineraries, and lower expectations. The relationship becomes adversarial. Tourists try to minimize losses. The city tries to maximize extraction. Trust disappears. This shift also affects residents. When tourism becomes predatory, it reshapes neighborhoods, pricing, and social dynamics. Locals adapt by avoiding certain areas, certain hours, certain systems. The city becomes layered, with different rules for different people. Visitors feel this separation even if they cannot name it. They feel tolerated, not invited. By now, the pattern is undeniable. New York is no longer selling an experience. It is selling access. Access to space, to movement, to visibility, to moments that should feel human, but have been priced into commodities. And this logic does not stop at the streets or attractions. Airports are supposed to be gateways, places of transition that welcome and release people smoothly. In New York, they function more like warning signs. The moment you land or attempt to leave, the city reveals its underlying logic with brutal clarity. Friction is not a flaw, it is part of the system. Arrival feels tense. Lines stretch unpredictably. Information is fragmented. Staff appear overwhelmed. Basic processes feel slower than expected for a global city. For first-time visitors, this creates an immediate sense of unease. You have not even entered the city yet, and already time, patience, and money are being consumed. Then, the costs begin to surface. Transportation options from the airport are expensive, confusing, or both. Taxis feel unavoidable. Ride shares surge instantly. Public transit requires navigation through unfamiliar systems while carrying luggage, under pressure, surrounded by crowds. Most people choose the fastest option, not the cheapest. The system anticipates this. Convenience becomes the first extraction point. Departure offers no relief. In fact, it often feels worse. Delays are common. Gate. Changes happen without warning. Seating is limited. Food prices inside terminals border on absurd. A bottle of water becomes a reminder that even leaving the city carries a premium. What should feel like closure instead amplifies frustration. Psychologically, airports set the tone. They are the first and last memory. When those moments feel chaotic, overpriced, and impersonal, they color the entire trip. Visitors do not remember the skyline or the landmarks as vividly as they remember the stress. The city's image fractures at its own borders. What is striking is how normalized this has become. Complaints are dismissed as impatience. Discomfort is reframed as global travel reality. But when a city consistently fails at its entry and exit points, it signals something deeper. Airports reflect priorities, and New York's priorities are no longer aligned with care, clarity, or welcome. There is also a symbolic weight here. Airports are where cities present themselves to the world. Cleanliness, efficiency, signage, and flow communicate competence and confidence. When those elements break down, they quietly undermine the myth of superiority. Visitors sense decline, not through statistics, but through experience. By the time people sit at the gate waiting to leave, many feel relief rather than sadness. Relief to stop spending. Relief to stop navigating friction. Relief to escape the constant calculation. That emotional response is telling. Cities that people love are hard to leave. Cities that exhaust you are not. This is why airports matter so much in understanding urban decline. They compress the entire experience into a few intense hours. They reveal how systems treat outsiders when pressure is highest. And in New York, that treatment often feels indifferent at best, hostile at worst. But even now, as frustration peaks, most people still hesitate to name what they experienced. They shrug it off. They tell themselves it was just a bad trip. That denial is not accidental. It is reinforced culturally, institutionally, and socially. And that leads directly into the most powerful hidden tariff of all. Not financial, psychological. The most effective hidden tariff in New York is not written on a receipt. It lives in the mind. It is the collective agreement to pretend that what feels wrong is actually normal. Visitors sense it quickly, but they rarely name it. Locals feel it daily, but learn to live around it. Institutions depend on it to keep the system intact. From the moment discomfort appears, people begin rationalizing. It's New York. That's just how big cities are. You have to expect it. These phrases function like psychological shock absorbers. They prevent deeper questions. They transform structural problems into personal expectations. If something feels exploitative, the logic says it must be your fault for not preparing better. This normalization is powerful because it is social. No one wants to sound naive. No one wants to admit disappointment in a city that is supposed to represent success, ambition, and cultural dominance. So visitors stay quiet. They complain privately, if at all. Publicly, they post photos, highlight moments, maintain the myth. Media and marketing reinforce this silence. Content focuses on highlights, aesthetics, aspiration. The financial strain, mental exhaustion, and constant friction are edited out. What remains is a curated fantasy that pressures everyone else to accept the gap between image and reality. When reality hurts, people assume they are the exception. This denial has consequences. It allows systems to degrade without resistance. Prices rise, services worsen, friction increases. And because no single moment feels catastrophic, nothing triggers collective pushback. The decline becomes gradual, almost invisible, a slow erosion disguised as progress. Visitors absorb this logic too. They leave New York feeling strangely unsatisfied, but struggle to explain why. They do not feel inspired. They feel depleted. Yet they hesitate to criticize openly. Instead, they adjust expectations downward for future trips. Shorter stays, fewer activities, less curiosity. The city quietly loses something more valuable than money. It loses trust. What is rarely discussed is how this affects identity. New York's myth depends on desire. When desire turns into obligation, the relationship changes. People stop dreaming about visiting. They start calculating whether it is worth it. That shift marks a deeper form of decline, one that statistics rarely capture. The most dangerous part of normalization is that it spreads. Other cities watch. They learn. They adopt similar models. They test how much friction people will tolerate before opting out. New York becomes a case study, not of success, but of limits. And this is where the story expands beyond one city. Because what is happening in New York is not isolated. It is a preview, a signal, a warning about where urban tourism and urban life are heading if extraction continues to replace care. When you step back and look at the full pattern, New York stops being an exception and starts looking like a prototype. What once felt like the capital of ambition now functions as a testing ground for how far a city can push before people quietly disengage. The hidden tariffs you have seen throughout this video are not accidental failures. They are signals of a deeper transformation in how major cities now relate to human presence. New York reveals what happens when a city prioritizes extraction over experience. When every system is optimized for revenue, friction becomes a feature. Stress becomes normal. Discomfort becomes justified as realism. The city no longer asks how people live, rest, or recover. It asks how long they will tolerate pressure before leaving. And increasingly, the answer is not very long. This is why fewer people feel excited to visit, even if they cannot articulate the reason. The dream has not disappeared overnight. It has thinned. It has become fragile. People sense that the cost is no longer just financial. It is emotional, psychological, and physical. The city demands constant attention, constant spending, constant resilience. Not everyone wants to prove themselves just to exist somewhere. What makes New York so important is visibility. When this model fails here, it sends a message everywhere else. Other cities are watching closely. Airports, transit systems, tourist districts, housing markets. The same patterns appear. Higher prices, lower tolerance, less patience for human needs. New York simply reached this stage first, and in doing so exposed the consequences. There is also a quiet irony. The city that once symbolized freedom, reinvention, and possibility now struggles to offer basic comfort without a surcharge. The gap between what is promised and what is delivered keeps widening. That gap is where trust erodes. And once trust fades, reputation alone cannot sustain desire. For visitors, this realization often comes too late. The trip is over, the money is gone, the fatigue remains. What lingers is a subtle question they may not even voice yet. Was it worth it? That question is becoming more common, more global, and more dangerous for cities built on myth. New York still matters, but not in the way it used to. It matters as a mirror, a warning, a compressed version of what happens when urban life forgets the human cost of its own ambition. Understanding this does not require outrage. It requires clarity. Because once you see the pattern here, you begin to recognize it elsewhere, sometimes before the city even admits it exists. And that recognition is where the next conversation begins. If you stayed until the end of this video, you already understand that this was not just about New York. It was about recognizing patterns before they become unavoidable. If this analysis helped you see cities differently, subscribe to the channel now. This is where we break down the myths that still shape modern urban life. Leave a like if you believe cities should serve people, not extract from them. And most importantly, leave a comment with the phrase, "I see the pattern," so others know they are not alone in noticing what usually goes unspoken. Now watch the next video appearing on your screen. It continues exactly where this story leaves off.